The sky over the University of Minnesota campus was almost offensively blue that day. The kind of blue that feels mocking when your world is about to crack open. My son, Samuel, was graduating with his business degree. 22 years. 22 years of late nights, school plays, soccer games, and agonizing over college applications, all culminating in this moment. I, Eleanor, stood among the other proud parents, plastered with a smile that felt brittle, like thin ice over a frozen lake. Beside me was Richard, my husband of 25 years. Or rather, the man I thought I knew as my husband, the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. Richard was fidgeting, constantly checking his phone. He was dressed immaculately, as always, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a coiled tension in his shoulders that I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I had, and had chosen to ignore. He kept glancing towards the edges of the crowd, as if expecting someone, or dreading their arrival, and then there was her. Bianca, Richard's assistant, a sleek, impossibly young woman with an unnerving confidence. Officially, she was there to help coordinate the celebratory dinner. Unofficially, she was a constant, grating reminder of the gnawing suspicion that had taken root in my gut months ago. She made my skin crawl. I'd built my life on a foundation of stability, on the solid ground of my marriage. I was a financial advisor, a pragmatist, a woman who dealt in facts and figures. And yet, for months, I'd been battling a feeling, an intuition that screamed something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. I tried to bury it, to dismiss it as stress, as a midlife crisis, anything but the truth. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. Samuel walked across the stage, shaking hands with the university president. My heart swelled with a mixture of pride and something else, a premonition, a shadow lurking just beyond the edges of my joy. I forced myself to smile, to clap, to focus on Samuel, on his achievement, to drown out the rising tide of dread. After the ceremony, the traditional photo frenzy began. Richard was even more agitated. He kept excusing himself to take calls, his voice low and hurried. Bianca hovered nearby, a silent, watchful presence. Her eyes darted between Richard and me, a smug, knowing glint in their depths. The champagne toast. It was supposed to be a moment of pure celebration. Samuel had given a heartfelt speech, thanking his professors, his friends, and us, his parents. He looked radiant, full of hope and promise. Then Richard stood up. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the sudden silence. The smile he offered Samuel was strained, unnatural. He raised his glass, but his gaze was fixed on me. "I have something important to share with everyone," he announced, his voice strangely detached, devoid of warmth. My stomach plummeted. I'd seen that look before, in my line of work. The forced calm before the storm, the rehearsed words before the devastating blow. I gripped my champagne glass so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I'm leaving," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death knell. "Bianca and I are in love, and we're starting a new life together." He paused, his gaze hardening. "I've already transferred our savings to ensure our fresh start." The world tilted. The blue sky seemed to darken. The sounds of laughter and celebration faded into a dull roar. I looked at Samuel, his face draining of color, his youthful exuberance replaced with stunned disbelief. I wanted to reach out to him, to shield him from this brutal public humiliation. Bianca stepped forward, placing her hand possessively on Richard's arm. Her smile was a viper's, triumphant and cruel. He was expecting me to crumble, to weep, to beg. He was expecting a scene. He was expecting me to be the victim. But something unexpected happened. A strange calm washed over me. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the culmination of months of repressed fear and suspicion. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was because I was prepared. I had seen this coming. And I was ready. I reached for my purse, feeling the reassuring weight of the manila envelope inside. My carefully laid plans were about to be set in motion. The game was about to begin. It started 3 months earlier, with a seemingly insignificant anomaly, a discrepancy in our joint accounts. I'd been reviewing our finances, a routine task I performed every month. Richard always claimed he was too busy, preferring to leave the details to me. A mistake, as it turned out, that would cost him everything. It wasn't a massive sum, but it was enough to raise an eyebrow. A series of unusual transfers, small amounts but frequent, to various online accounts. And then there were the hotel charges. Expensive hotels, downtown hotels, hotels that Richard had no reason to be staying at. As a financial advisor, I was trained to spot irregularities, to uncover hidden patterns. It was my job to protect my clients from fraud, from mismanagement, from betrayal. Little did I know I'd have to use those skills to protect myself. The charges appeared on days when Richard claimed to be working late. He'd call me around 7 p.m., his voice weary, telling me he was stuck in meetings, that he'd grab something to eat at the office. I used to believe him. I used to feel sorry for him, picturing him hunched over his desk, sacrificing his evenings for the success of his consulting firm. Minneapolis isn't that big of a city, and the same hotel name kept popping up, the Marquette, downtown just 2 blocks from his office. Always on Wednesday nights. Always the same suite. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed proof. Solid, irrefutable proof. I started digging deeper, meticulously tracking every transaction, every receipt, every suspicious movement in our accounts. Years of working with numbers had taught me patience, precision, and the art of uncovering hidden truths. The evidence mounted steadily. Dinner reservations for 2 at expensive restaurants, jewelry purchases from Tiffany's, first-class plane tickets to the Caribbean, destinations I'd never heard of before. He claimed it was for a business conference, and I'd believed him. I remember feeling envious that he was jetting off for a vacation and I was stuck at home. I was a fool. Then came the offshore account. He thought he was being clever, hiding money in a Cayman Islands account, a classic move for someone trying to conceal assets. But he'd forgotten one crucial detail. I'd handled our taxes for the past 15 years. I knew every legitimate account, every investment, every penny we'd saved together. These new transactions stuck out like neon signs in the night. I felt a cold, creeping dread. It wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated, premeditated plan. He was building an escape route, brick by treacherous brick. The final confirmation came from Melanie, a friend of mine in HR at Richard's firm. She'd called me one afternoon in March, her voice hesitant, laced with concern. "Eleanor, I think there's something you should know," she'd said. "Bianca just filed for a transfer to your husband's new satellite office in Bermuda." Bermuda. It all clicked into place. The hidden money, the secret accounts, the planned announcement at Samuel's graduation. He'd chosen that day deliberately, thinking the public setting would prevent a scene. He'd underestimated me. He'd underestimated the power of a woman scorned. That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I contacted Vivian, my lawyer, a formidable woman with a reputation for ruthlessness. Together, we spent weeks preparing everything: the divorce petition, the asset freeze, the tax fraud evidence. I quietly moved our savings into a separate account, meticulously documenting every suspicious transaction, gathering irrefutable proof of his affair. I was playing chess, and Richard didn't even know he was on the board. Richard finished his announcement, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Bianca, emboldened by his declaration, had the audacity to wave a first-class ticket in front of everyone. "Our flight to Bermuda leaves tonight," she gloated, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "We've already found the perfect beachfront property. With your savings." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Samuel's hands were trembling with barely suppressed rage. I could feel his eyes on me, pleading for a reaction, for some kind of explanation. Our friends and family shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to leave or stay for what promised to be an explosive confrontation. Richard turned to me, his expression a grotesque mixture of triumph and pity. "I've left you enough for a few months' expenses," he said, his voice condescending. "I think that's more than fair, considering—" "Considering what?" I interrupted, my voice surprisingly steady. "Considering that I helped build your consulting firm from scratch? That I managed our finances while you focused on your career? Or considering that I've known about your plan for months?" His smile faltered, just for a moment. Bianca's hand tightened on his arm. "What do you mean you've known?" she demanded, her confident facade cracking slightly. I reached into my purse and pulled out the thick manila envelope I'd prepared. "You know, Richard, for someone who prides himself on attention to detail, you really should have been more careful with your email password. The one you've used for 20 years. Samuel's birthday. Not very original." The color began to drain from his face. I could see him mentally calculating, trying to remember what damning emails might be lurking in that envelope. "Your plan was clever. I'll give you that," I continued, standing up to face him directly. "Setting up the Bermuda account, planning this announcement for Samuel's graduation, where you thought I wouldn't make a scene. But you forgot something crucial about me. And what's that?" he managed to ask, his voice slightly hoarse. "I don't just manage our family's finances. I do this for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the transfers? The hotel charges? The secret account in the Cayman?" I smiled, enjoying the way his eyes widened with each revelation. "Or maybe you thought Melanie in HR wouldn't tell me about Bianca's transfer request to your new Bermuda office?" Richard's hands were shaking now. Bianca had taken a step back, her triumphant smile replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Here," I said, holding out the envelope. "Before you leave for your new life, you might want to look at this. Consider it my graduation gift to you both." As Richard took the envelope with trembling fingers, I savored the moment. Everything I'd discovered, everything I'd prepared, was about to come to light. And the best part? He had no idea what was coming next. Richard's hands trembled so violently that the papers almost slipped from his grasp as he tore open the envelope. I watched him in silence, a cold detachment settling over me. He was a study in slow-motion panic. The first document he pulled out was the divorce petition, already filed and stamped by the court. A blatant declaration that the life he thought he was escaping was already being dismantled, piece by piece. What the hell is this?" he stammered, finally lifting his eyes from the page, disbelief warring with a dawning horror. I took another sip of champagne, the bubbles tickling my nose. "Oh, just some light reading for your romantic getaway," I said sweetly. "You might want to pay special attention to page 3. Bianca, her face flushed, leaned in to peer over his shoulder. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into his arm as she read the bank statements. Our joint accounts. Current balance, 0. Every penny had been legally transferred weeks ago to an account solely in my name. "You can't do this," Richard sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "That's our money." "Our money? You mean the money you were planning to steal?" I interjected, raising an eyebrow. "The money you've been slowly siphoning into offshore accounts." I gestured towards the next set of documents. "Speaking of which, the IRS is very interested in your creative accounting methods." The color drained from his face as he flipped through the papers. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, email printouts detailing his affair with Bianca, including their plans for this very announcement. Each page was another nail in the coffin of his carefully crafted escape plan. Samuel stood beside me now, his graduation gown rustling as he moved closer. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you were really going to do this? Today? Of all days?" Richard couldn't meet our son's eyes. Instead, he frantically shuffled through the remaining papers until he reached the court order freezing his assets. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. "Everything's frozen," I explained calmly. "Your personal accounts, your business accounts, even that lovely little nest egg you thought you'd hidden in the Cayman. My lawyer is quite thorough. Bianca's triumphant smile had completely vanished. Babe? What's happening? What does she mean everything's frozen? I turned to her, a hint of mock sympathy in my voice. It means, dear, that your sugar daddy is officially broke. Well, not broke exactly. Just unable to access any of his money. I hope you kept your return ticket, because it looks like that beachfront property in Bermuda might have to wait. The gathered guests watched in stunned silence. Melanie, who had helped expose their plan, tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile behind her hand. Richard's younger brother, Charles, shook his head in disgust, while his wife, Grace, whispered, "Good for you, Eleanor. You've ruined everything," Richard hissed, his facade of control completely shattered. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "No, you ruined everything the moment you decided to betray our family. I'm just making sure you face the consequences of your choices." The stack of papers slipped from his grasp, scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Bianca scrambled to pick them up, her face flushed with humiliation as she realized their perfect plan was unraveling in front of everyone. Richard's composure crumbled as he reached the final document, a formal letter from his company's board of directors. His hands gripped the paper so tightly it crumpled at the edges. The letter detailed an immediate investigation into his relationship with Bianca, citing potential abuse of power and misuse of company resources. "You went to the board?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Actually, I didn't have to," I replied calmly. "It seems someone else noticed your inappropriate behavior with a subordinate. The ethics committee has been watching you for months." Bianca's face went pale. "What does this mean for my position?" "Well," I said, setting down my champagne glass, "I believe the HR term is immediate termination. Though, given the circumstances, finding another job in Minneapolis might be challenging." Richard suddenly straightened, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous. I built that company from nothing. They can, and they have," I cut in. "The board's quite concerned about potential lawsuits. Apparently, you're not the first executive to think he could use his position to pursue younger employees." Samuel stepped forward, his graduation cap now clutched in his hands. "I can't believe you did this, Dad. To Mom, to our family, to everything we've built." "Son, you don't understand," Richard pleaded, reaching for Samuel's arm. "Sometimes marriages just don't." Samuel jerked away from his touch. "Don't try to justify this. You were going to steal Mom's savings and run away with your assistant on my graduation day. I understand perfectly." Bianca, now gathering her composure, attempted to salvage what she could. "Richard, they can't prove anything about us. We can fight this." I laughed, the sound sharp and clear in the tense atmosphere. "The email thread where you both planned this entire scheme, including today's announcement, the hotel receipts, the witness statements from your coworkers, I think they can prove quite a bit." Several of our guests had quietly slipped away, but many remained, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Richard's brother, Charles, approached, placing a supportive hand on Samuel's shoulder. "How long?" Charles asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "How long have you been planning to abandon your family?" Richard's silence was damning. Bianca answered instead, her voice shrill with defensive anger. "We've been in love for 18 months. We shouldn't have to hide it." 18 months, I mused, tapping my chin thoughtfully. "Interesting. That's exactly how long I've been documenting everything. Every transaction, every meeting, every little lie. I had a feeling it might come in handy someday." The weight of realization crashed over Richard's face. While he'd been meticulously planning his escape, I'd been 2 steps ahead, quietly building an ironclad case against him. His perfect plan, his dreams of a new life with his young assistant, his carefully hidden money, all of it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Richard, cornered and desperate, made one last attempt to salvage his crumbling world. He lowered his voice, adopting the persuasive tone he'd honed over years of business negotiations. "Eleanor, be reasonable," he said, his eyes pleading. "We can work something out. Split everything 50/50ths. Keep this civil." 50/50ths? I echoed, genuine amusement in my voice. 50/50ths of what, exactly? The money you tried to hide? The company that's about to terminate you? Or perhaps you mean the house that's solely in my name? His head snapped up, shock registering in his eyes. What do you mean, solely in your name? Remember last month when you were too busy to attend the mortgage refinancing meeting? You just signed the papers I brought home. I smiled, watching comprehension dawn on his face. You really should read documents before signing them, Richard. The house has been transferred to my name only. Bianca grabbed Richard's arm, panic rising in her voice. What about the Bermuda property? Our deposit? Frozen, I replied, along with every other transaction you've made in the last 6 months. Though I suspect the property developer might be interested to know the funds were obtained fraudulently. Richard's face contorted with rage. You vindictive bitch! Dad! Samuel's sharp voice cut through the air. Don't you dare finish that sentence. The remaining guests watched in stunned silence as Richard's carefully crafted facade finally shattered. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked his age. Defeated. Broken. The settlement papers will be at Vivian's office on Monday, I continued calmly, gathering my purse. Don't bother trying to access any accounts before then. And Richard, I paused, meeting his defeated gaze. I suggest flying coach to Bermuda. First class might be a bit out of your price range now. As Richard and Bianca slunk away from the graduation celebration, their dreams of paradise dissolving into a cloud of humiliation and legal woes, I turned to our remaining guests with a bright, albeit slightly strained, smile. Well, I said, now that the unexpected entertainment is over, shall we properly celebrate Samuel's achievement? Melanie rushed forward to hug me, her eyes shining with admiration. Eleanor, that was absolutely brilliant, she whispered. I've never seen Richard speechless before. Samuel wrapped an arm around my shoulders, squeezing me tight. Mom, I can't believe you've been planning this for months without letting on. How did you stay so calm? Years of handling other people's finances taught me patience, I replied, squeezing his hand back. And watching your father's schemes fall apart was worth every second of waiting. Charles raised his glass, a genuine smile spreading across his face. To Eleanor, who just gave us the most satisfying show of justice I've ever witnessed. And to Samuel, whose graduation will certainly be remembered for years to come. The remaining guests laughed and clinked their glasses, the tension in the room finally dissolving into a celebratory atmosphere. Everyone gathered around to congratulate Samuel properly, their earlier shock replaced with a sense of relief and admiration. Grace, Charles's wife, pulled me aside, her eyes twinkling. That letter from the board, you timed everything perfectly, didn't you? I smiled. The ethics committee had been building their case for months. I just made sure their announcement coincided with his planned escape. Timing is everything in finance and in revenge. As we moved the celebration to the restaurant I'd reserved, notably not the one Richard had planned to use, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of Richard's betrayal and deception had been replaced by a sense of triumph and freedom. Samuel leaned over and whispered in my ear, his eyes full of gratitude. Best graduation gift ever, Mom. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Vivian in her downtown Minneapolis office, reviewing the final divorce settlement. Richard had signed everything without protest. The fight completely drained from him. He was a broken man, a shadow of the self-assured, successful executive I had once known. After our graduation day confrontation, the company's ethics investigation had revealed even more than I'd uncovered. 3 other young assistants had come forward with stories of Richard's inappropriate behavior. The board had terminated him immediately, effectively ending his career. His reputation in the business community was thoroughly destroyed. Bianca, facing her own professional crisis and the prospect of being branded a homewrecker, had quickly abandoned their plans for a new life together. Last I heard, she'd moved back to Chicago to live with her parents, her dreams of being a trophy wife in Bermuda thoroughly shattered. The house is secure, the assets are protected, and the tax fraud evidence has been handed over to the proper authorities, Vivian said, organizing the final papers. I'd say this is one of the cleanest divorces I've handled, despite the circumstances. I nodded, a sense of closure washing over me. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the months of agonizing suspicion, all of it was finally behind me. I was free. Samuel, who had accepted a job offer in Minneapolis, took me to dinner that evening to celebrate. The restaurant was small and intimate, a world away from the ostentatious displays Richard had favored. "You know, Mom," Samuel said, swirling the wine in his glass, "I've been thinking about what you did. How you handled everything so strategically. You were like a ninja!" I laughed, feeling a surge of warmth at his praise. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Would you consider doing some financial consulting for my new company? We really need someone with your expertise and, well, your tenacity." I smiled, touched by his faith in me. "I might be interested," I said, "though I hope you've learned to read the fine print on any documents before signing them." He laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound. "Trust me, that's one lesson our whole family won't forget." As we enjoyed our dinner, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Richard was gone, his betrayal a painful memory, but also a catalyst for change. I was no longer defined by my marriage, by his success, by his failures. I was Eleanor, a woman who had survived a devastating betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The blue sky that had seemed so mocking on Samuel's graduation day now felt like a promise of new beginnings, of uncharted territories, of a future filled with hope and possibility. And as I raised my glass to toast my son's success, I knew that sometimes the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about reclaiming your life, finding your strength, and building a future that is truly your own. It was the satisfaction of knowing I orchestrated the whole plan. It was beautiful. Life after Richard was surprisingly liberating. It wasn't easy, of course. There were sleepless nights, filled with replays of past conversations, dissecting every interaction, every perceived slight. There were moments of overwhelming sadness, a deep ache for the life I thought I had, for the future that had been stolen. But there was also a sense of exhilarating freedom. I was no longer constrained by Richard's expectations, by his ambitions, by his suffocating presence. I could make my own choices, pursue my own dreams, define my own happiness. Working with Samuel was a joy. His company, a tech startup focused on sustainable energy solutions, was filled with bright, ambitious young people. They valued my experience, my knowledge, and my unwavering commitment to ethical business practices. I found myself energized by their enthusiasm, by their belief in a better future. I was also surprised by how much I enjoyed having my own money, my own space, my own life. I redecorated the house, turning it into a reflection of my own personality, a sanctuary filled with light and laughter. I took up painting, something I'd always wanted to do but had never found the time for. I reconnected with old friends, women who had known me long before I was Miss S. Richard Harding, women who saw me for who I truly was. But the past has a way of lingering, of casting long shadows. Even as I built a new life, I couldn't completely escape the wreckage of the old. One evening, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Charles, Richard's brother. His voice was strained, hesitant. "Eleanor," he said, I don't know if I should be calling you, but I thought you should know." My heart clenched. "Know what, Charles?" "Richard's back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He's living in his car, near the old office. He looks terrible." I think I think he's in trouble. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, resentment, pity, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of concern. I pushed it down. He'd made his choices. He had to live with the consequences. "What do you want me to do, Charles?" the first asked, my voice cold. "I don't know," he admitted. I thought you should know. He's lost everything, Eleanor. Everything." I hung up the phone, feeling a knot of unease in my stomach. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that Richard's fate was no longer my concern. But Charles's words lingered, a nagging reminder of the man I had once loved, the man I had built a life with. A few days later, I found myself driving past Richard's old office building. I told myself I was just taking a different route home, that I wasn't deliberately seeking him out. But as I approached the building, I slowed down, my eyes scanning the darkened streets. And then I saw him. He was sitting on a bench, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, his face gaunt and unshaven. He looked years older, his eyes hollow and haunted. He was a ghost of the man I remembered. My first impulse was to drive away, to pretend I hadn't seen him. He didn't deserve my pity. He didn't deserve my help. He'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. But then I thought of Samuel. I thought of the pain Richard had caused him, the humiliation he had inflicted, and I realized that turning my back on Richard now wouldn't just be punishing him. It would be punishing myself. It would be allowing his bitterness to poison my own heart. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. Richard didn't see me at first. He was staring blankly at the ground, lost in his own private hell. "Richard," the first said, my voice low. He started, his head snapping up. His eyes widened with disbelief, then narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough and defensive. "Come to gloat?" "I don't want anything," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "I just wanted to see if you were okay," he scoffed. "Does it look like I'm okay?" He gestured around him, his voice laced with bitterness. "I've lost everything, Eleanor. Everything. You lost it yourself, Richard," the first said. "You can only blame yourself." "I know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I hurt you. I hurt Samuel. I hurt everyone I cared about." He looked away, shame etched on his face. For the first time since the graduation announcement, I saw a flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. "Charles called me," I said. "He told me you were living like this." "Charles is a good brother," Richard said, his voice softening. "He's the only one who still talks to me." We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the hum of passing cars. "There are shelters, Richard," the first said. "Places where you can get help." "I don't want charity," he said, his voice hardening again. "I don't want anyone's pity." "It's not charity, Richard," the first said. "It's help." "Everyone needs help sometimes." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Why are you doing this, Eleanor?" he asked. "Why are you helping me after everything I've done to you?" "I'm not doing it for you, Richard," the first said. "I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it so I can finally move on, so I can finally put the past behind me." I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card. It was for a local homeless shelter, one that offered not only food and shelter, but also job training and counseling services. "Here," I said, handing him the card. "Give them a call. They can help you get back on your feet." He hesitated, then took the card, his fingers brushing against mine. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely audible. I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," I said. "But everyone deserves a second chance." I turned and walked back to my car, leaving him sitting on the bench, clutching the business card in his hand. I didn't know if he would use it. I didn't know if he could ever truly redeem himself. But I knew that I had done what I could. I had extended a hand, offered a glimmer of hope in the darkness. And that was enough. Weeks turned into months. I didn't hear from Richard. I tried not to think about him, to focus on my new life, on my work, on my friendships. But the image of him huddled on that bench, lost and alone, continued to haunt me. I found myself donating to local homeless shelters, volunteering my time to help those less fortunate. I realized that Richard's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had also opened my eyes to a wider world, to the suffering and injustice that existed beyond my comfortable bubble. One day, Samuel came to me with a proposition. He was expanding his company, hiring new employees, and he wanted to create a program to help people with troubled backgrounds get back into the workforce. "I know it's a long shot, Mom," he said, "but I think we could make a real difference. We could give people a second chance, a chance to prove themselves." I smiled, touched by his compassion. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Samuel," I said, "and I'd be happy to help." As we worked together to develop the program, I found myself thinking about Richard. I wondered if he had ever called the shelter, if he had ever found a way to turn his life around. One afternoon, as I was leaving Samuel's office, I saw a familiar figure walking down the street. He was wearing a clean shirt and pants, his hair neatly trimmed. He looked healthier, stronger. It was Richard. He saw me at the same time, his eyes widening with surprise. He hesitated for a moment, then walked towards me, a hesitant smile on his face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice stronger than I remembered. "It's good to see you," Richard the first said, returning his smile. "You look, well, I'm doing better," he said. "I took your advice. I called the shelter. They helped me get back on my feet." He told me he'd been living at the shelter for several months, working hard to rebuild his life. He'd taken a job as a janitor at a local community center, saving every penny he could. He'd also been attending counseling sessions, confronting his past mistakes, and learning to cope with his demons. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted, his voice filled with emotion. "But I'm determined to make amends, to prove that I can be a better person." "I'm glad to hear that, Richard," the first said genuinely. "I wanted to thank you, Eleanor," he said, "for giving me that card, for giving me a second chance." "You earned it," Richard the first said. "You earned it." We talked for a few more minutes, catching up on each other's lives. He told me he was hoping to find a small apartment soon, to start a new chapter. He also said he wanted to reach out to Samuel, to apologize for his past behavior. "I know he may never forgive me," Richard said, his voice filled with regret. "But I owe him an apology. I owe you both an apology." "Give him time," Richard the first said. "He'll come around." As we parted ways, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I had finally forgiven Richard. Not for his sake, but for my own. I had released the anger, the resentment, the bitterness that had been poisoning my heart for so long. A few weeks later, Samuel called me, his voice filled with excitement. "Mom, you won't believe who just applied for our job training program." I knew exactly who he was talking about. Richard started the program the following week. He worked hard, applying himself with a determination I hadn't seen in years. He learned new skills, made new friends, and proved himself to be a valuable asset to the company. Samuel, initially hesitant, gradually warmed up to him. He saw the genuine remorse in Richard's eyes, the unwavering commitment to change. They began to talk, to share stories, to rebuild their broken relationship. One evening, I came home to find Samuel and Richard sitting in my living room, talking and laughing like old friends. My heart swelled with happiness. "Mom," Samuel said, "Richard has something he wants to ask you." Richard stood up, his face flushed with nervousness. "Eleanor," he said, "I know I don't deserve it, but I was wondering if you would consider having dinner with me? Just as friends." I looked at him, at the genuine hope in his eyes, at the transformation he had undergone, and I knew that he had finally earned his second chance. "I'd love to," Richard the first said, smiling. The future was still uncertain. I didn't know if Richard and I could ever be truly friends. I didn't know what the future held for either of us, but I knew that I was finally free. Free from the shadows of the past, free from the bitterness of betrayal, free to embrace a new horizon, filled with hope, forgiveness, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. My heart was open, and I was ready to face whatever came next, with strength, with courage, and with unwavering faith in the power of second chances. The ordeal was hard, but it led me to where I was now, happy and free. Years passed. Samuel's company flourished, a testament to his vision and the dedication of his team, including Richard. The job training program became a model for other businesses, a living example of how compassion and opportunity could transform lives. My role at Samuel's company evolved. I became more than just a financial advisor. I was a mentor, a confidant, a voice of experience guiding the next generation. I found immense satisfaction in helping young entrepreneurs navigate the challenges of the business world, sharing the lessons I had learned from my own trials and tribulations. The relationship between Richard and Samuel blossomed. They became close, working side by side, sharing successes and failures, offering each other support and encouragement. The bond that had been broken by betrayal was now stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of forgiveness and redemption. Richard, in turn, flourished. He proved himself to be a dedicated and reliable employee, earning the respect of his colleagues and the gratitude of those he helped through the training program. He never fully regained the wealth or status he had lost, but he gained something far more valuable: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a sense of self-worth. My own relationship with Richard evolved slowly, subtly. The romantic love that had once defined our marriage was gone, replaced by a different kind of connection, a deeper understanding, a quiet respect. We became friends, sharing meals, attending concerts, offering each other companionship and support. He became a part of my life, not as a husband, but as a valued friend, a reminder of the past and a testament to the power of forgiveness. One sunny afternoon, Samuel, Richard, and I were sitting on my patio, enjoying a barbecue. Samuel's wife, Chloe, and their 2 young children were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air. As I watched them, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Despite the pain and heartbreak of the past, I had found a new kind of happiness, a new kind of family. A family forged not by blood or legal ties, but by shared experiences, by mutual respect, and by unwavering love. Richard raised his glass, a warm smile on his face. "To family," he said, "in all its forms." Samuel and I clinked glasses with him, our hearts filled with love and gratitude. The sun shone down on us, bathing us in its golden light. I knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and unexpected twists and turns. But I also knew that we would face them together, as a family, bound by the unbreakable bonds of forgiveness, redemption, and love. The ripple effect of my choices, the pain I endured, had led to this moment, this profound sense of peace and belonging. And in that moment, I knew that everything in its own way had worked out perfectly. The end.